Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, dear friends. Welcome to the next event of the New Energy Advancement Hub. I'm Tatiana Mitrova, NEAH Director and Founder, and I'm really very pleased today that I have this great opportunity to speak with our guest, Christof Ruehl. Christof is my colleague at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. I know him for many, many years. He is also very well known in the energy circles as former vice president and chief economist at BP. And in my view, he is probably one of the best experts on energy security and energy transition and the way how the global energy markets are functioning. And I'm really happy that today we have an opportunity to discuss all these topics together in their complexity. So, Christof, welcome to our event. Welcome to our conversation. Please join me.
Hello. I have to get the camera on. Hello, Tatiana. Good to see you. Thank you for the introduction. You stole the line. I wanted to say good morning, good midday, good afternoon. That is okay.
Yeah, where are you today?
I just arrived yesterday night in Abu Dhabi, just in time after the call.
Great. Warm greetings from Buenos Aires, where I am today. So I think this diverse geography is a good start for this conversation that we've planned for today and which is really global and very vast. So we are going to talk about energy security and energy transition, whether we can learn anything out of that. And without further ado, I think I will give the floor to you to share your thoughts on where we are, what is happening with the global energy markets, what is happening with the global energy security, and what is happening with the global energy transition. Let's start with these simple questions.
It's a small little challenges. No? Let me get some slides up at least for the beginning. And let me start by telling you, or we should probably tell the audience what I have in mind is just to summarize a presentation which deals with some of these questions Tatiana has mentioned, not in any depth, but just in no more than 30 to 40 minutes to leave a lot of time for discussion afterwards. And so let me start by saying what this presentation is and what it isn't, especially when it comes to the learning part. This is an attempt to look at what has happened to European energy markets after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when energy was becoming weaponized and when people were very worried about energy security. And all of a sudden, this topic of energy security in its very rare form of just availability and affordability and nothing else sort of became the top of the agenda again. And at the same time, concerns about climate change, about security and the sense of sustainability of the energy we have, took a distinct second position, even though these were the topics which had been discussed for a long time before. So all of a sudden, the question was, how do we get enough oil, gas, and coal, the very fuels which in the previous years were meant to be eradicated by the energy transition? And I was sort of intrigued by this, and many other people as well, and asked, are there possible consequences of this reminder of energy security for the way we look at the energy transition? Can we have an energy transition without reconsidering the importance of energy security? I remember, this is probably better than any summary, I was at an FT conference somewhere and I said this, there can be no energy transition without energy security, and there will be no energy security without fossil fuel. And I have in my whole life not received so many protesting emails and comments on WhatsApp and what have you, because they took that sentence and twittered it. And a lot of people, let's say, disagreed. But this is where I was coming from, to ask the question, what does this episode of insecurity tell us, if anything, about the energy transition? And the way the paper or the notes are structured is extremely simple, and I will stick to this in a short summary. We will first sort of just recapitulate very briefly, because many of you in the audience will know this better than me, what has happened when energy became a weapon of economic warfare at the beginning and after the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, and how this big worry of a threat to everybody's energy security seems to have disappeared, and we'll ask how that was possible. And then we switch from there, have a look at the energy transition. And energy transition is many things to many people. What I mean by energy transition is, more than anything, this simple narrative. The majority of people working on this topic and concerned about this topic is following, I think it's fair to say, to the present day, which is that we have a problem with greenhouse gas emissions, number one. Number two, the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is the global energy system. Number three, therefore, that's where we have to put the focus of our efforts, and we do it in a very simple way. We basically talk about the process of substitution. We want to eliminate fossil fuels, and we want to replace them by non-fossil, non-emitting fuels, modern renewables such as wind and solar, but also probably things like hydroelectricity and nuclear, which are non-combustible and do not emit greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the central feature of this narrative in my mind, and I think it's a fair assessment that this is a process of substitution. So while the substitution may take time, it may be very expensive, that's what people are arguing about, it should be clear that during the energy transition, the capacity of fossil fuels globally will not increase. It should be shrinking, because every growth should be taken up by modern renewables, and ideally substitution should take place at the same time. So the capacity of fossil fuels should go down. And the remaining questions are, how fast is this possible? What does it cost? What do we need to do to get it done? And I will argue in that second part that it's not so simple, that in fact, for many good reasons, this is a shortcut which is impossible to take, because substitution is not always possible, full stop. And one can show that with a little bit of analytical effort. I also want to be very clear what this presentation is not. This is not me ranting about climate change and denying climate change or anything of that sort. I'm worried as you are. I'm maybe a bit more skeptical towards certain things, like that there's a linear relationship between our carbon emissions and our Paris targets. But these are details. I'm saying what I'm saying with the goal in mind of finding a better way of getting this transition going, a more realistic way, if you want, not with within the back of the mind any feelings which would say this all bullocks climate change. I don't believe it in the first place. That is not the purpose of the exercise here. It's kind of sad that one has to make that clear if one has a slightly different opinion, but so be it. And then
okay, so we've noted, it's just a disclaimer that Christof is not climate skeptic. I just want to stress it many times. As I said, I know you for many years, and I can justify you are not.
Not a climate denier. Skeptic about the approach, not about the goal. Let's put it that way. Yeah. And then finally, the third point is just put the two things together. What did we learn about how this energy security situation was diffused, at least for the time being? What did we learn about the energy transition, why it seems to be stuck? It seems to not move very fast. And is there anything, can we learn in the double sense? Are we able to learn in general, which is hopefully yes. And is there something particular which we can learn? So let me start with point one, just very quickly recapitulate what I think everybody knows. When the invasion of Russia happened in 2022, this was, of course, nothing which fell from the sky. It was something which had been prepared many years, since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And as a result, I think every participant, from Russia on the one hand to the G7 as a proxy for Russia's enemy on the other, had sort of planned for the eventuality that this conflict would become a harder conflict, possibly even a war. And the thing which has happened in all these diplomatic efforts before it actually turned into an invasion was what is referred to as economic warfare. There was planning on both sides, I think, what to do and how to react to which eventuality, with the aim in mind of using economic means to support military or paramilitary goals. At the beginning, this economic warfare took the surprising course confiscating Russian financial assets. It concentrated on financial markets. But the constellation is a unique one in history. And in that constellation, energy sooner or later had to move into the front line. What is this constellation? Russia, the world's biggest commodity and energy exporter, exports 12% of all the energy which is traded across borders globally. And then its nemesis, its enemy of the other side, probably the best shortcut is just to say the G7 plus the European Union, producing more than half of global GDP. And of course, in order to produce more than half of global GDP, you need a lot of energy imports. And so this tackling of sanctioning Russian energy exports was from the beginning fraught with the fear that the G7 and the European Union would harm itself by making energy less available, more expensive, and then doing damage to its own economies. And at the same time, they knew that this was where Russia revenue come from. So it confiscating assets of the Russian central bank, of Russian financial system, could always only be a first step, because in the end, it is about the flow of curtailing the assets in the flow. It took until the summer, until Russia gradually cut off gas exports to Europe, until this really became a war, an economic warfare centered around energy sanctions and attempts to circumvent these sanctions. This is just, while I'm talking, so you have something in the background here. In the middle, this picture, which looks like a flower. Now I don't see the audience, so I cannot ask you if you know what it is. That is an accidental satellite shot of the moment the Nord Stream pipeline exploded. So it's always a good thing to ask the audience without the title on top of it. But what happened next is then a series of sanctions against oil, a series of cutoffs against gas into Europe. But to make a long story really very short, I think it is fair to say that we have seen a tremendous adjustment, avoiding the fears which many in Europe had at the time that this would be a very long and very cold winter without much electricity. Gas was redirected, replaced in Europe, mostly with LNG deliveries from places as far away as the US, to a large extent also at the expense of Asia by, of course, voluntary redirections of Asia. Gas prices, we will see in a second, spiked tremendously to support this. And oil, which came a little bit later and was more a story of, sorry, I have it wrong. So this is oil here, actually. Here's the gas story, the replacement of gas in Europe by imports, mostly from the US. And oil was a story of sanctioning oil imports into Europe, and then seeing a tremendous readjustment, trade readjustment, where Russian oil exporters reoriented themselves mostly, and at the beginning exclusively, into three countries: China, India, and then Turkey. How was that, in the very short storytelling here, how was that made possible? In the case of crude oil, clearly by a large price differential emerging long before anybody talked about the price cap or so, which made it possible for Asian consumers who had not joined the sanctions to get Russian crude oil imports at a discount of anywhere between 30 and 40% to the market, which they happily did. So that provided an incentive to ship this oil into Asia and replace the deliveries to Asia from the Middle East with deliveries of the Middle East into Europe, so that that balanced itself out. And the reason why it happened in gas is even more obvious. There was a tremendous price spike, a price increase of the magnitude which we have not seen before, of course, and which would have been very hard to sustain for consumers. But governments stepped in, importantly, not to suppress this price increase, but in order to shelter households and consumers from it by supporting them, making it able to pay these high prices. Lo and behold, this is a story of unprecedented, I would say, very large scale trade adjustments in a very short period of time, triggered by prices. And now, of course, everybody expects to say that this was a market which works and so on, which is true, and prices are the main instrument for these markets to make these adjustments possible. But since we want to talk about different fuels, different types of primary energy and the energy transition later, it is also important to be clear what has happened here. This was all carried out in the realm of fossil fuels. It was mostly securing oil for transport and industry, gas for industries and for heating. It was made possible because primary energy, when it comes as fossil fuels, can be, number one, transported, Number two, it can be stored. And where do we have that? Yeah. And number three, it can be controlled. What I mean by this, you can take oil, gas, and coal and you ship it across borders. You can take it and you can store it, and it's divisible, so that makes it even easier. And that means you, as a human or as a consumer, have control over it. Once it is somewhere there, you turn the flick and the light goes on or the heating goes on. This is not the case necessarily for renewables and for the wind and the sun, which did not play a very big role in this adjustment. So here's again an overview picture of the price movements underlying this adjustment. But what I really want to get at is that at the moment of panic in the fall of 22, and then also subsequently as the deliveries came in, as there was no energy crisis at the end of the day, one has to be clear that it was fossil fuels which managed to ratchet up, to go into the right directions, and to deliver that outcome. So they kept the lights on. They provided this energy security in this very rough and ready rudimentary sense of energy being there and being halfway affordable with help from the government maybe, but being there. Renewables by their nature have a problem, in at least in power generation, which is the intermittency problem, of which you're all familiar with. Nobody denies that anymore, that sometimes there's no wind and sometimes there's no sun, and storage capacity for renewables is still very underdeveloped. So they had to take a backseat because they could not provide this adjustment. This is something which we have seen before in crisis situations in Fukushima, but this is something which I think is a very big and sometimes underestimated advantage of the often condemned fossil fuels, of the dirty part of the global energy system, that it is controllable and can prevent interruption. It's just better at mitigating shocks by its nature than modern renewables, in particular those renewables which have the intermittency problem, that they're not always available. And you cannot transfer the wind and the sun across borders, only very short distances after they have been converted into power, electricity, and you cannot store them, at least not at the scale which is necessary to avoid serious disruptions. And therefore, you cannot have the same degree of control when you need to prepare for eventualities as you can have with fossil fuels. So I think this is a very simple outcome, which everybody can understand. It is also, at least to observers like me who have seen energy markets for a long time, a surprise to what an extent and how efficient a crisis really could be avoided. I was a bit more skeptical when this happened at the beginning, including more skeptical of the wisdom of governments to just allow these redirections of trade and so on to happen. And the question is, we come back to at the end too, as I said earlier, is there something we can learn for the energy transition? Can there be an energy transition to these modern renewables with their intermittency problem without having this kind of energy security? Or can we do an energy transition which somehow replicates the security in another way? That means we have to talk now a little bit about the energy transition, part two. And this is an even more complicated topic, and I have to try to make it even more simple. So in cases like that, what I like to do is to go a little bit back in history and just ask a simple question. What do we mean by this energy transition? Is it really something completely new, or do we already know something from previous days? And I would argue, if we take the notion of energy transition very sloppy, very loosely, we could say it is a change in the dominant fuel. If we accept that as a definition of transition, as I said, very loosely, not very rigid, then we had already two energy transitions in history. One was the switch from wood and from biomass generally to coal in the 18th century, and the other was the switch from coal into oil in the 1960s. Now, both of these transitions had a few very common, very important characteristics. Number one, they were clearly driven by economics. Coal was superior to wood and exhibited a pattern where wood was first replaced. So there was genuine substitution taking place. Coal performed the same functions of heating and lighting as wood did. And then it was powerful enough and it had so much competitive advantage, then it created a whole new set of industrial activities. Coal is not for nothing called the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. Steelworks, industrial activities, all of this was a second wave of new and hitherto unknown activities based on this new fuel, confirming it was not only better than wood in a strict sense of substitution, but it also made possible completely new economic developments. And the same story later for oil. Oil, higher energy density, at the beginning it was cheaper and so had a competitive advantage vis-a-vis coal. It replaced coal. At the beginning, oil was not concentrated in transport. It replaced coal under the boiler for heating, for power generation everywhere. And then it did the same as coal had done 100 years earlier. It created a whole secondary wave of new activities, which are still shaping our world, from plastic production to individual transport in the internal combustion engine. So the same picture, a huge economic incentive to use it to replace what was there before, and then enough economics power, so to speak, to unleash a wave of activities based on that new fuel. It's rare in history that something changes because of energy, but those two things are examples. And they have one more characteristic, which is, as Dan Jürgen says, he has this nice phrase, rather than just energy transitions, they were much more energy additions. And since oil has replaced coal, consumption of coal has tripled, and the consumption of oil more than doubled. So all components of that system continue to grow. Now, if we look at our energy transition, sorry, I just go ahead and then this is certainly not the case. Nobody introduced the wind and the sun because it had a cost advantage. Costs came down massively. Now it has an advantage sometimes, but that was an effect rather than a cause for their use. And now coming to the energy narrative of the energy transition, which I mentioned earlier, here the story is certainly not one of a system which continues to grow in all its components. Look at the energy system here on the left-hand side. There is not one single fuel, not one single component of commercially traded primary energy which has ever peaked. Everything continued to grow. And these two transitions were accelerators for growth, if anything. Now we are saying in this narrative, energy transition is the substitution of the dirty component of the global system with clean fuels, and it is based on the assumption that the capacity of fossil fuels stops growing. If you look at the numbers, 7.5% of the total energy production, primary energy production consumption today is modern renewables, geothermal, biofuels, wind, and the sun. 82%, if you also take account of nuclear and hydroelectricity, 82% is fossil fuels of primary energy consumption today. So now we are saying we want to shrink these 82%, possibly to zero, while we replacing the system with endowing the system with renewables, mostly intermittent renewables. That is an extremely stark contrast to the expansion in all fuels and all components which we have seen in the past. The energy transition which we want today is not based on economics, it's a change in preferences. We, the people, or the politicians, have decided we don't want the climate to heat up. There's a real danger, so we change the energy system. That's a shift in preferences, not an economic incentive. And secondly, we have decided to do this in a way which will actually shrink the biggest component of the system in order to make space for newer, cleaner fuels. Big differences, and things which should leave us skeptical just by comparing these huge numbers with each other. The energy transition, as it has unfolded so far, is very heavily concentrated in one segment, which is the generation of a different type of energy, which is the conversion of primary energy into power. That is the case, I think, for one prime reason, which is that power generation really is an activity where all fuels can compete. You can generate electricity with wood, with the sun, with wind, with coal, with gas. And on the right-hand side, we see that's how this happens. And so 90% of the expenditures of the investments in the current energy transition went into the power sector so far. And I'm just mentioning that because I want to, for now on, concentrate on the power sector and on the role it plays. Now, it's easy to say, okay, this will be difficult and all of this, but we can actually show it. And when we concentrate on the power sector, I think this is something Tatiana is very familiar with also, and we group the different fuels, then you go back 40 years, almost 40 years, and you see that the shares of fuels, oil and gas on one side, dirty coal on the other, and then non-fossil fuels without greenhouse gas emissions, in the generation of power globally have almost not moved at all in 40 years, despite all the expenditures, despite all the discussions, despite all the COPs in the world. How can this be? This, of course, is a feature of a relentlessly growing system. In order to, you can increase all of these fuels all the time, including renewables. You will shift shares either not at all or only very small, and you will shift them only if this particular fuel grows faster than the other components of the system. And this has not been the case so far on a prolonged period. For some periods, some fuels have grown faster, then they have fallen back again. And this explains why the composition of the system has actually changed remarkably little over time. And to me, this is one indicator that something is wrong in the state of Denmark, as they used to say, that something is not working in the transition. The gap between where we want to go and what we need to do and what has actually happened so far is large, and it is increasing from COP to COP. And I think we have a sense of that. I want to at least mention that, which also motivates this research, that there's an increasing amount of people who are skeptical, and they don't know. It's hard to say it now because you don't want to be in the wrong corner, and they don't know exactly what is wrong, but they've sensed that we are stuck. And I say it openly, as they sense that the Paris targets probably will not be met. And that's another thing which I feel very strongly. When I look into the numbers, there is no chance that we will meet the 1.5 Celsius target, and also the 2.5 target, short of a very, very major economic breakdown of a global nature. But I think that train has already passed, but we haven't yet admitted it. The climate change people have not come forward and say, guys, we will miss it. We'll come back to that topic. So when I now put on the driller, and I think there's something wrong here, this doesn't move, the targets is not going to be met, but it's not discussed. Why is that? And I think there's 5 points one can single out. The first one is something which everybody knows and everybody agrees with. This kind of substitution, which is the energy narrative suggests, is very expensive and probably very small, so it may be just prohibitively expensive. Everybody complains about it. I accept that is a possibility, it's a criticism, so we may just get stuck there. But then I would argue that there are two much more important fundamental things. One is that substitution analytically may indeed be impossible in many circumstances. And a corollary of saying that is that it may be possible only in countries which grow very slowly. Let me explain this. When you follow the current narrative and you want to expand your, stick with power generation, your energy consumption, say you have a country which consumes 10 units of power, now it wants to have an 11th unit, then of course, making the energy transition work means that this 11th unit should be renewables, let's say wind and solar for simplicity. Right? And when you have an addition of wind and solar in the system, as everybody agrees, because of the intermittency problem, you also need backup generation for those cases when the wind and the sun will shine. There's now slowly starting some numbers coming out from McKinsey studies and others. They put for European countries the backup requirement at roughly 50%. Now, okay, it could be 30, it could be 70, but let's just stick with this for the example. So you have a country, 10 units it consumes, let's say this fossil, it adds an 11th unit, which is renewables, it needs 50% backup generation. Now it could either build backup generation has to be absolutely reliable, of course. It's the epitome of energy security, if you want. And for that reason, it is typically made of fossil fuels. Not always, but typically. So back to the example, the country with its 10 units adds an 11th unit wind and solar, needs half a unit backup capacity. Now it could either build another half unit of fossil fuels, but in the energy transition narrative, remember the capacity which exists of fossil fuels is not supposed to grow. It's supposed to shrink over the long term. So the alternative it can do is to add another half unit of renewables, which would free up half a unit of fossil fuels in the system, which was either too busy providing electricity. Now that half unit needs to back up, so you can produce another 0.25 units of renewables, which would free up another chunk of fossil fuels in the system, and so on. It's like a geometrical progression, and before many words, let me just show you how it looks like. It looks like something which is extremely familiar to economists from a different context. Here, this delta C is the capacity increase you need if you want to have an increase in generation delta G. So in our example, the increase in generation is 1 unit. And the P is the share of generation you need for backup purposes. If you have renewables, is 50%. And if you add this together, then it tells you that in order to have generation capacity increase by 1 unit, and 50% backup requirement, you actually need 2 units of new capacity. So instead of adding 1 unit of power and solar and wind, you need to add 2 units of solar and wind. And that, I think, is it's not an argument, it's not even an analytics study, it's just a description of what is going, which I think is by and large completely correct. And you can then play around with the numbers. What will fall out of that is that in many instances, when the requirement for delta G for new generation capacity becomes very large, and there's examples which we can discuss, for example, in China or so, then the required capacity increase is too big to be done within that time. Right? So one example here, so suppose China's electricity demand grew by about 40 units per year over the past 10 years. Right? To do all of this with renewables would have required 800 times 2 with a multiplier of 2, right? 800 units, roughly speaking. And that would have been 4 times the global average of the actual growth. Clearly just not feasible. In the event, the Chinese had not 400 and not 800, but 100, still more than any other country in the world. Still probably at the limit because they actually did a lot. But it's just not feasible to have these kind of large additions as long as you have to provide backup generation capacity. That, I think, is a very serious argument, and in the interest of time, I will leave it there. The corollary is that it is much easier to do this when you have an economy where electricity demand grows very slowly or falls. For example, that's something like Germany, a rich country, very thick network of fossil generation capacity, which can be used, it's important too, and then declining the electricity consumption. They can actually replace that over time. They will have no problem in principle to substitute. A fast-growing developing economy quickly comes to the situation where it depends on the numbers, where it physically cannot substitute anymore. And this is a hard constraint. It's a technological constraint. It cannot be cured by throwing money at the problem. Very important. And then there is something else in the background, which I will just mention now. When you have fast-growing developing economies, often they are in the process of industrialization. When you industrialize, your energy intensity increases. That means the amount of energy per unit of GDP goes up. And when you then later become a service economy, it goes down again. So again, countries which are in this fast growth mode because they industrialize, that narrows their activity, their scope for making these changes for substitution. And finally, the corollary to that is you have to not only look at fossil versus non-fossil capacity, you also have the composition of fossil to play with. And there, of course, makes a difference whether you use coal and gas, and a big difference. Let me just show you some pictures to have these 3 things together, but let me repeat it so that even if the technicalities we have to get into depth in later, maybe if they're less than clear, that you get this argument. First point, substitution in the standard narrative may be very expensive. Okay, granted, this is what we discuss left, right, and center all the time. Should the rich world pay for the poor world? Was it unfair that the US and the UK could industrialize and China could not without environment constraint? Let's put that aside. Second point is a new argument is that there's a technical reason for substitution and a certain extent, quite common, I should add, circumstances not being feasible, full stop. So that means you can talk about it and talk about money transfers until the cows come home. It just cannot be done. And that includes point number 3, which means it's easier to do this in principle for slow-growing, stagnant economies, especially if they have a large existing network of fossil fuels, than for fast-growing economies, which don't have so much fossil fuel networks to back them up. And then 4 and 5 also together, energy intensity, the amount of energy you need in your stage of economic development, and also the fossil fuel mix which you use play a big role. That's again something which has been discussed occasionally, but never really sort of accepted as a general constraint. These are the 3 sort of building blocks. I'll just give you one example for this, for the last point of energy transition, for the last point of energy intensity and carbon intensity, the mix of energy. Here, you see something on the left-hand side, growth of GDP, something everybody wants. Everybody wants to have fast economic growth. and then growth of energy. And what this shows you is a scissor which goes apart quite nicely, because energy grows slower than GDP. That means global energy intensity improves, becomes less. That means we are capable of producing more and more and more economic output with relatively less and less energy input. That's what everybody wants. But there's something else which we could do, which hasn't been done, which is to look at the energy we use and to look at the amount of CO2 here should be actually greenhouse gas emissions, which we emit per unit of energy. This is the carbon intensity of energy. And you see on the right-hand side of this line, this is all standard forecasts, so don't take them too seriously. Look at the left-hand side of the line, and you see that that scissor has barely opened at all. This is another measure of the lack of success of this substitution, which actually took, to the extent that carbon intensity has improved, this was much more the consequence of replacing coal with shale gas, for example, in the US, than the consequence of replacing traditional fuels with intermittent renewables, it has to be said. That's just one example for that third point. Let me jump over it, and let's now try the difficult sort of spagat of bringing these things together. I think the core here is when we say we cannot always do substitution, but we need this backup capacity, that at the moment we really have no, what's at the core of the problem is that at the moment we have really no substitute for the energy security, for the reliability, and also the affordability with which energy can be provided by fossil fuels. That has been highlighted in the Ukrainian crisis, but it's just present even when we look at the energy transition. And so consequently, one should expect other policy measures to become more prominent if the energy transition is going to be a success, not only this insistence of substitution. So here's some general lessons. The first one I mentioned already. It's inconceivable to have an energy transition which is subject to an increased risk of energy security. It would be so fraught with failure. At some point, it would just be rejected by people. A second sort of and this has to come from fossil fuels for the time being, just for lack of better technological alternatives. A second thing which is very important is, instead of just thinking of two components of the system where one has to replace the other, we need to start thinking in terms of complementarities. We need to be able to make smart combinations within fossil fuels, but most importantly, between fossil fuels and renewables, the two main components of the system. So we look at it in a holistic way. We think of instances where, for example, a new coal power plant could provide backup generation and would result in an overall increase in the share of wind energy. That's perfectly possible to construct cases like that. It's not done today, but it should be done in the interest of targeting aggregate emissions, not some abstract principle. And then, of course, we should expect the solutions to incorporate things like simple economic consequences like a carbon price. Let me jump straight to the kind of conclusions which I see coming out of this. Once again, it was motivated in part, of course, by Ukraine, but also by this feeling that the energy transition is stuck. Not much has happened. And more to the point, I personally, I mentioned it already, think that it is pretty obvious now to everyone looking at the numbers that the Paris targets cannot be reached. Full stop. And there's nothing to do with how, the carbon emissions translate into temperature rises, whether that's plausible that it's linear or not. Let's put all of this aside. It's just impossible because we have already too much of a share of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. If that cannot be done, then we have to rethink. We either give it up, and it will be an interesting moment when the panel for climate change comes out and says, okay, we failed. Because then there's, of course, the risk that the population turns cynical. But I would assume that people will still be worried about climate change and want to double up. So in that scenario, what would this doubling up or this reorientation mean? And I think it means, number one, something that you need simple economic incentives. This is something we all have discussed many times. Nobody likes it, but it will come back on the agenda, is a carbon price. Without a carbon price, not much can be evaluated, not much really can be done seriously. But then there will be two new things. One is there will be an increasing efforts on taking complementarity seriously. So that is to replace this substitution narrative. What do I mean by this? Just give some example. One complementarity would be when you, inside the fossil fuel sector, think about, as a program, with the help of a carbon price probably, but could also be quotas, of something which has happened already as a result of market forces in the US, which is the replacement of coal by gas. It should not be laughed out of the window, it should not be derided. It's an important component, and one just has to sit down and like with an input-output matrix, figure out where in the world is the most benefit from this, where should the gas go and the coal be stopped. But it's also much more interesting complementarities. We don't think much about it. Think about hydrogen, the new super hype. It's a bit like it's the fuel of the future, probably always will be, but people think almost exclusively about green hydrogen. Now think a moment for gray hydrogen, what this actually means. So you could produce hydrogen from natural gas. You can also put a CCS installation right at the wellhead and a factory which transforms that natural gas then into hydrogen, and you take the carbon and you use it and put it back into the same wellhead without big transportation problem and looking around the world. So you marry two technologies, one to take carbon out of existing fuels, the other one producing something new, like on a large scale, like hydrogen, in order to do so without the carbon emissions. That's something which today would not find many friends in either financial circles to be financed or in political circles to be supported, but which seems to me eminently sensible. And it's just one example of the things one can come up with if one starts to change glasses and think about complementarities in a fresh way. The third one is also, in a sense, new, but in another sense, of course, trivial, is things will become much more important, which are centered not only in avoiding to produce carbon or greenhouse gas emissions in general, but also in take them out of the atmosphere. This can be crazy things like geoengineering. I'm not going to go there, but it can be also eminently sensible things. And here is one example of something which I think is terribly important and will become terribly important and is not sufficiently recognized yet, including not for the dangers it possesses. That is the market for offsets. The market for offsets, the idea is very simple, that if you do something which blows up carbon in the atmosphere and somebody else somewhere else in the world does something which takes carbon out of the atmosphere, then this person who does that should be able to issue some sort of certificate, get financially rewarded by you so that you can buy your way out. Now think about the world we live in. You have literally dozens of countries and hundreds of big multinational companies who have made zero carbon emission pledges for some time between 2030 and 2050. We know, I would argue, when we are serious and look at the numbers, that they cannot strictly do that. They will have to find some other way around it to claim success. What will they do? They will buy offsets. When Tatiana flew to Buenos Aires, I don't know which airline you took, but I'm sure somewhere when you bought your ticket, there was a little box which you could tick and you could pay $17 and it would say, okay, for this, your carbon footprint will be offset. The carbon which was emitted because of your person on that plane will be offset by your airline company buying some certificate. You have no idea what certificate, you have no idea what it really costs, you have no idea who really did it, but that's the idea. Again, it's a new market. It's something which has happened only once in the world, in Europe, for a time, and it was called CDM. Was loosely translated, became known as the Chinese development mechanism. Why? Because, and don't shoot the messenger, because it was just an awfully hopelessly corrupt system. It meant that some people, not only in China, they would go to their local government, get a stamp because they said we planted X trees, and turned that stamp, that document into the European Commission and got cash for it. It was so bad, you have never heard of it because it was just secretly buried and nobody talked about it anymore. And now we have this thing, energy, the biggest of all economic inputs, goes directly and indirectly into any kind of economic activity you can even think of. Only labor could be comparable, but labor needs energy. Energy doesn't need labor. And so that, and a large part of that, 82% of that big thing is fossil and needs to be cleaned up, and a large part of it cannot be substituted. That means this market for offset will be necessary and it will be giant. And don't think of it only in planting a few trees here, making a swamp there. Think of it also in incorporating things like CCS, carbon capture and storage, the hydrogen example. That would also show up as an activity which can be traded because it eliminates carbon. A huge market. And of course, if that market turns wrong, because it becomes corrupt, because it is not regulated appropriately, because it gets stuck on the national level, because it cannot globalize, or because it becomes financially unstable because it's not regulated. That would be a disaster and throw progress back many, many years. One of the few people on the planet who recognized that is a guy called Mark Carney, who used to be central bank president of Canada and then the UK. He was heading, I understand, a group of people within the IFI framework who wanted to build up these regulations, prepare for this market. And after 2 years of trying, he threw the towel. He gave up. It was not possible. There was too many interest groups involved, not enough developed government interest in making this work. And so this is a long way of saying I wanted to single out at least one example to put some meat on these skeletons here, which mean where you have new things coming up, which will, under a new narrative, very quickly, and even without the narrative, gain in prominence and gain in importance, and about which we need to think now, because even if it wasn't included in the old way of thinking about the energy transition, it will be an important component. At the end of the day, it's all about net aggregate greenhouse gas emissions, and if they are minimized by taking off some old ones with new modern instruments, that to me is just as good as if it is by avoiding them altogether by having more windmills or solar panels. And the fourth and last point is again something trivial, something which was big in the discussion some time ago, has disappeared a little bit. But if the developments continue as the scientists tell us they will, then of course adaptation is another issue which will be with us again on a big scale. I stop here. Sorry, it was a bit longer than I thought, but I leave it here.
Wow, Christoph, I mean, wow, it's probably the best reaction here because that was really very comprehensive, very provoking, I would say. Yeah, and I've got so many questions. I've decided not to interrupt you while you are talking. Yeah, but now I will go through the whole list if you agree. So first of all, you've started with the geopolitical background. Yeah, with the energy securities, which suddenly arose 2 years ago, and Russian of Ukraine, and all the sanctions imposed, and yeah, that's a long story. Not directly related to the energy transition but at the same time, as you've mentioned, it went in a different way than people were expecting. So just one brief question. Do the sanctions work? What do you think? Was it a relevant mechanism?
I think they did work, but they didn't work enough to either have a tangible effect on Russia, on its behavior, or to reach up to the expectations associated with it. The best example is the price cap. The world would not look very different today without the price cap. In the sense it probably diminished Russian revenues a tiny little bit as they had to increase transaction costs by hiring a whole different fleet and all of that, but it wasn't a game changer. And the reason is, of course, that what the G7 and what the G7 and the European Union tried to do is have their cake and eat it too. You cannot sit on Russia's energy exports and then say you punish Russian revenues. That just doesn't add up.
Yeah, I remember that was the plan, to keep Russian oil and gas coming to the market, but to decrease the revenues. Yeah, it's really a difficult task. But you've mentioned that in this particular reality case study, renewables didn't play a role. Yeah, so didn't they at all? Or was there any input, at least in the European market? We saw quite a considerable demand increase for renewables in 2022. Yeah, IEA is reporting similar or even stronger renewables capacity additions for 2023. So was there this input from the new energy?
It's a very tricky thing, and one has to be very careful. So the argument, when you just follow the day-to-day discussion in the newspapers and even among energy people, was as long as they were scared, so until in the middle of the winter 22-23, everybody agreed renewables don't play a role, they can't help us because they may or may not be there when push comes to shove. Then when the winter was over, and the longer in the past it is, the more it disappears in the rearview mirror, the more it now sounds like a success story of renewables. And the reason is, as you said, renewable demand has increased in 22 and in 23. It was a very, 22 was a very, so it looks like renewables had done their share in replacing it. But the truth is, and that becomes forgotten as time passes, that it was a very strange year, because when you remember, 22 was not only the year where Russian gas disappeared from the European Union, it was also the year where hydroelectricity was extremely low because of a massive drought, and where basically the entire European nuclear fleet was out by maintenance in France, or because they could no longer be cooled by the rivers. So we had an all-around decrease in otherwise reliable fuels, not only in Russian gas. And against that background, renewable production held more or less steady, and so its share increased a little bit. So now, when you look in the rearview mirror and you don't know about these details, you could say, okay, gas went down, renewables went up a little bit, coal went up a little bit. So they contributed, renewables, like every other fuel. But in reality, that is not the case, because the lion's share was indeed done by gas and by coal, which had to be redirected. And the main point here is also not so much about the numbers, but about the threat to energy security, because you can calculate with a delivery of you have contracted of liquefied natural gas, if you have the infrastructure, of course. But you cannot calculate with the wind taking up the slack, because you don't know at the end of the day whether it will happen or not. And that it has happened in the aftermath, in that sense, it's not proof for reliability. You know, it's just an accident. You could have put the other way around as well.
But then, Christoph, so if we assume, let's imagine that we are lucky with energy transition, that it works, we are transitioning, what will happen with the energy security? You've mentioned that the very quality of renewables, yeah, the energy density, the ability to store them, the flexibility, transportability, if I may, yeah, they are much lower than with the fossil fuels. So does it mean that in the green system, without fossil fuels, we cannot actually ensure the needed energy security level?
I think, the unpleasant as it is, I think the bottom line answer is yes. Of course, there's different levels of energy security and all of that, but it means to admit that at the moment, with our technologies, without a certain backbone of energy, which includes fossils, also nuclear, also others, there will not be enough energy security to really push the energy transition into an impact large enough that it becomes visible in the numbers, that these three straight lines really change. That's not very pleasant to admit, and that just means that one has to find other ways of combining it. But when you think about it right now, it's very hard to think of any country, in particular of the fast-growing developing countries, who would be willing to jeopardize its energy security in a systematic way by not having fossil fuel backup. China wouldn't do that. India wouldn't do that. Nobody really would do that. Because it's one thing to say, okay, there might be bad weather, there might be a nuclear accident, there might be a blow up in a refinery. That's one thing. These things can happen. But it's another thing to say, okay, I'm constructing an energy system which is inherently vulnerable, and nobody would want to do that. And that means that until we have found a better solution, we will need fossil fuels to some extent, not as much as we have, of course, but to some extent. And it also means we need to start thinking, how can we combine them intelligently so that the share of renewables becomes higher? How can we choose which fossil fuels are better than others at certain tasks, these kind of things, rather than just thinking about this rather primitive either or. The energy system is a holistic whole, has two big components, fossil and renewables, but they have many subcomponents, and they can be combined in surprising ways, and that's what we have to work on.
So, for example, large utility scale battery storage or hydrogen, they can improve the level of energy security for the greener, not completely green, but greener systems. But still, you assume that for the time being, with the technologies that we have, completely getting rid of fossil fuels is not feasible from the energy security point of view. It will be, the system will become too vulnerable in the imperfect world where geopolitics is still playing very important role, as we saw during 2022, 2023, and I'm afraid in the nearest future as well.
This is correct. From the energy security point of view, before even starting to think about the production of plastic bottles or things like that. So a good example also, it's not only Russia and Ukraine, but Fukushima. When they had this nuclear accident, the lights were kept on by shipments of coal and natural gas, and by them still having thermal power plants. If they would have a complete segment of wind energy and solar energy backed out by nuclear energy, that would have meant that the system would have fallen apart when you switched off the nuclear. And what I meant is that I can't see, especially not developing countries, especially not in an area in the world which is not peaceful, but where conflicts rise, where military expenditures rise, the potential for more economic warfare increases and not decreases. I can't see countries really sort of demusculating themselves to such an extent that they would voluntarily forego energy security. And that unfortunately means there will be a backbone of fossil fuels in the system. Has to be managed. You could rephrase it a little bit. As long as you can come up with a theoretical example where a new dirty power plant, actually by providing backup security, increases the share of, say, wind energy in the system of a country, as long as that's the case, there will always be an attempt to move in lockstep and to increase fossil fuels or decrease them slower than desired. So the idea that there can be substitution until there's zero would work only with technologies which we don't have today.
With the world that we do not have today. I mean, again, from the geopolitical perspective. But does it mean now the most sharp question? Does it mean that transition is impossible?
Yeah, that comes. What does the economist say? It always answers, it depends.
From one hand, on another hand.
No, it really depends. So if we mean by transition that that the majority of our energy, and especially of the growth, that's the important thing, of the growth of energy is provided by non-greenhouse gas emitting primary energy, that's possible. I'm sure this is possible. It may take some time. So if energy transition is supposed to mean that fossil fuels disappear without other things in place, like new technologies, then it will not be possible. And what we have to do in this situation is to be very clear-headed about this, because when you tell people, here's a problem, but hey, it's actually easy to solve. We know how to do it. In principle, it may cost some money, there may be some pain, but in principle, we can do it. And this is not the case. And then you have to admit to people, no, sorry, it wasn't that easy. Then you create backlash and you create cynicism and all these unpleasant things. And so from that perspective, the answer is yes, it's possible if it's sensibly identified, and it will be faster if we are more honest to ourselves.
And COP28 decision fit into this story.
Yeah, I was laughing when they were bargaining about, this was actually a conversation about the substitution theme and should it be enforced or not. And of course, sort of to scale down fossil fuels has to be part of it. There's no doubt about it, And that's why the position of saying, no, we don't want this, that's why it had to fail. But it is equally important, the words, than orderly transition or sensible transition. So I think I'm not a big friend, of these COPs and 70,000 people flying to a desert where every food piece is flown in as well, but have some realism where you say, yes, of course, we want to get rid of fossil fuels, but also we know we need them in certain instances, and we need to do this in an orderly way. I think is not a bad outcome at all. What I'm disappointed with since Glasgow, and what I'm waiting for, is the international community coming clean and saying, we have the Paris targets, we all signed up to them, we will not reach them. Because that is one of these moments where you could create cynicism or political backlashes. Now these guys, they don't realize, that Joe Blow doesn't really appreciate these kind of meetings and doesn't really understand them, fine. But when they have to come in to say that something which has been touted so much and which still is, declared to be achievable, has failed, then there is the moment of risk that the audience says, okay, boring player, I'm concerned about something else. I don't think this will happen because there's too many effects already going on with the weather, and so people will probably say, okay, we now have to continue to pursue this objective. But it's equally likely that a lot of people will just wave goodbye to the project because they think, okay, it's not possible, and so let's see what happens.
So when these announcements that Paris targets cannot be reached will come out, what do you think will be the reaction of the global community? First of all, so you've mentioned some of the potential reactions, but then what will happen? What will it mean for different fuels? What will it mean for fossil fuels? What will it mean for hydrogen? So do assume that there will be some dramatic shift in the energy policies of the different countries. Because as you've mentioned, so far the consensus is that, okay, the window of opportunity is closing, but there is still some space left. We still can do it if we will all focus. We do not focus, but we declare that we will focus. So the hope is still there. When the
So it
hope
could
goes away.
hope dies last. Yeah. So it's thinkable. It's possible that, in theory, that some countries would say, okay, we signed off to this, but that's it. We're not going to sign off to anything new because we have seen this leads to nowhere. It's possible that people, politicians, or economic groups or energy producing groups are starting to accuse each other of being their fault. If the Russians hadn't, if the Saudis hadn't, if the Chinese wouldn't, and that's also possible. But hope dies last. So my hope is that it will be the other way around, that people say, okay, we messed up. Now let's sit down and think more seriously what needs to be done. And the more discussion one has before that moment happens, discussions of the nature which we are having here, the more it becomes almost a certainty that people start moving a little bit behind that framework which has failed. And we have to admit to ourselves there was a simple way of thinking of it. That simple way has failed. Renewables and things which are just coming, like hydrogen. I like to compare this with, there was a big discussion until about 100 years ago about autarky in food production, where countries argued that it's better for them if they produce their own food and don't import and don't export, because then there's food security is higher. They're not depending on the bad neighbors, for their bread, their daily bread and so on. This problem, when you also translate it into energy, this proposition has two serious flaws. One is economic. It's completely inefficient. I mean, if every country produces its own food, it's more expensive, it's more wasteful, it's less good food, and all of this. Economically, this makes no sense. Trade, after all, exists because there's a mutual advantage. Otherwise, there will be no trade taking place. And secondly, in particular in energy, but also food, it doesn't really improve energy security. It just means that you're not diversified. You bet a lot on local sources. Again, the Japanese example, suppose it would have been the perfectly green system and they would have closed their borders, and then the backup fuel hydrogen nuclear power would explode and would be not available. Then the whole country would have to shut down the moment the wind doesn't blow, only because they were internationally integrated, globally integrated, could they survive that. Europe now, with its natural gas after the Russian cutoff, same story. Oil markets after the sanctions, same story. So this idea that localization, doing everything yourself, is either somehow efficient or is somehow security enhancing, is never, as for the point of efficient, and rarely for the point of security, true.
So it's not about self-sufficiency, it's more about diversification, or at least a mixture of these different approaches to energy security, correct?
Yeah, people say that this was Churchill who said energy security lies in diversity and diversification alone. And that's probably true.
And another question on the with these quite disappointing results of the energy transition so far, are we facing less government?
You disappeared. Are we facing less?
I'm asking, are we facing less government support? So do you think the governmental subsidies and regulations and all the pushes we saw previously towards energy transition, do you think they will slow down?
Yeah, this is a very interesting point. This is another way in which one could actually use this Russia-Ukraine example, which I agree with you, otherwise it's a bit disconnected from the transition question. It's more of a case study. But if you fast forward sort of what all this means now when we think of the next 2 or 3 years, there will probably be, Russia will still exist. The war will in one way or another frozen over or contractually, we don't know, but hopefully at some point at least the shooting will stop. What kind of a world is this? It will almost certainly be a world of low fossil fuel prices because all these distortions will be adjusted. Russia will not be blocked from exporting. It will reestablish itself over time. The world cannot afford, to cut out biggest commodity exporter on the planet. It will also, so low fossil fuel prices means hard time for renewables to compete. It will almost certainly be a world in which the government finances are much more constrained than today. We see government debt rising everywhere. And more importantly, we see the mindset of people going back to the 70s. So every big problem, you throw money at it as if there's no tomorrow. Corona, thrown a lot of money at it, wars, money at it, building up the armies in Europe again, throw money at it. Since the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, the general habit, now you see it in Biden with the IRS program, with renewable energy as well, throw money at it. The big questions are addressed by throwing enormous amount of money at it with the applause of the public. And that leads to this high indebtedness. So over time, governments will be severely constrained in what they can do in terms of subsidization and all that. So they will look for instruments which give them more bang for the buck. And that's why I think carbon prices will come back, carbon taxes will come back, schemes like that, and incentives rather than subsidies, temporarily restricted things like cross-border carbon taxes, which could actually generate some revenues. That is what we will see on part of the government. So in a sense, it will be less government because it will be more on the regulatory side, not in the direct, supporting enterprises picking winners side. But in another sense, it is more government because the regulations will certainly be tightening up.
Let's talk a bit about this carbon price issue. So, do you think that in this quite geopolitically divided world, it is possible to have one single global carbon market with all these trade barriers and different taxation systems, and some countries not interacting with the other countries and imposing sanctions? Can it work at all?
Yeah, it has to, and I think it can. When it comes to carbon prices, the question is always, does one want a market price? So where a government sets the volume of carbon available, be blown up every year and then sells certificates, and the market price of the certificates determines effectively the price of carbon? Or should it be a carbon tax, where everybody who blows up carbon gets taxed a certain amount? So where you set the price and then you see what the volume outcome will be. Formally, they are almost equivalent in most cases, but I'm in favor of carbon markets for a purely pragmatic reason, which is that we know from history that unifying tax systems across countries, exactly your point of making it available everywhere, seems to be impossible, even in terms of a really severe crisis. I mean, you're sitting in Argentina, and it would not be possible even at that point in time to unify a system between Uruguay and Argentina. Countries just don't like, to share their tax ways. But it is comparatively easy to allow markets to merge and trading to take place in different locations and then prices to rebalance. And so I think a cap and trade pricing system can spread across different countries in sensible ways. And of course, the prices wouldn't be as high as today in Europe or in California, but they probably wouldn't be as low as today in China and settle somewhere in the middle. But that is certainly possible. And I think a cap and trade price system is easier to internationalize than a tax system. But even taxes have their place. And you think of the European tax, the planned tax for imports to tax their carbon content. So, for example, if I would be a large energy producer and would sit in Saudi Arabia, so I would give myself a carbon tax, because then I could export to Europe, import into Europe all my oil and gas without them taking the taxes. I would keep the taxes because I have already a carbon tax on it. And things like that. If it's the same game, and if it's played intelligently, if it's not overly complex, it can all work towards a carbon price. Right now, we have a biting carbon price only in California and Europe, and that's not enough.
What about the market for offsets? You've mentioned all these corrupted schemes and intransparencies and speculations and everything. Do you think it can be avoided? Do you think there is a future for offsets?
So this, to me, is probably the single most important next step in the energy transition. Much more important than will hydrogen work or will nuclear fusion comes, because it is in our hands, as nations and as politicians, and so to design that well. And the idea that if you have a market for offsets, that at least as much economic incentive and brain power goes into the questions, how do I remove carbon, which is already there, as today goes into the questions, how do I identify fuels which prevent carbon from being emission? That is a brilliant idea, because right now we're spending too much on one part of the question, how to prevent energy causing greenhouse gas emissions, and not enough brain power on the other half of the question, how do I tackle what is already there in order sort of keep the system going but make it cleaner? Remember, it's always about the net aggregate. And the market for offset is the single biggest step to address this other half, which has been so neglected under the current narrative. That's why I wanted to learn. I want to learn more about it. I want to see, and I think because it's an institutional thing which can actually be done, it's not chasing some difficult technology question and not knowing how to do it. It's something which we know how to do, how to install a global market. I think for that reason, it probably has a good future. I certainly hope so.
And you were talking, you were quite skeptical about this substitution approach, proposing instead a complementarity approach. But can you provide a couple of examples how these complementarities could look like, in a smarter way of energy system design?
Yeah, I mean, we have already mentioned one which sort of cuts across the different components nicely, which is gray hydrogen. If it's done in a different way, you know Russia better than me, better than anyone in the energy world side of it. If they have the chance to produce that so that with CCS, the carbon would be limited, and then to use existing infrastructure to ship it or so, I think, forgetting a moment for the political and geopolitical situation, that would be a way forward for an energy system like that of Russia, which they would be keen to use.
So then you are talking about blue hydrogen with CCS, right? So not unabated completely. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Where you take the CCS to put it back into the earth at the wellhead. And there's many. So when I look at the UAE, where I'm speaking from, with all these advertisements of big solar farms and the cheapest in the world and all of that. But I go around here and, it's one thing to have these solar plants and then be fighting the dust and fighting the way how the electricity is brought to town and all these things. Nobody talks about it. The other part of it is that you drive around and you don't see a single solar panel on any house. And that's in a country where electricity demand, because air conditioning demand, coincides with reliable high sun filtration. So
how comes?
There's some need for substitution here, just as there is in Europe or in the US for replacing coal with natural gas, and to stop arguing about whether that is a second best solution or not. It lowers net carbon emission. That's all that should count. And as I said earlier, I am German and I follow this discussion, of course, about the energy transition in Germany, with this privilege of having declining energy demand and having a very sophisticated existing system and having lots of money, all of which helps. And how difficult it is even there. If one, instead of radically redesigning and big north-south connectors, rebuilding the grid completely, if one would allow for a bit more mix of fossil and renewables in power generation, the overall effects on carbon emissions would be greater, and especially the speed with which these progress could be made would be much faster than always waiting for the first best. The first best is to build a lot of wind power in the north and then build a new grid system which transports it in the south, where the traditional grid runs from east to west. The reality of Germany today is they importing nuclear power from France and coal power for electricity from the Czech Republic, and having these grand discussions. It would be much more sensible to ask yourself, okay, given our structure, where can I mix renewables and fossils in such a way as to provide backup generation, which makes the system work? Or for that matter, which is really very dicey in some countries, but to reopen the discussion of how smart is it to cut off nuclear if the energy transition is really such a high priority target. So these are all examples of complementarities which are not hard to find, but which have been more or less excluded from the discussion because many people don't like the idea of touching anything which has greenhouse gas emissions. In that sense, the best is always the enemy of the good here in this transition.
So it looks like you are suggesting to replace the metrics from the share of non-fossil fuels in the total energy consumption to the net level of emissions. Yeah, which means a different approach in decision making. Yeah, it's a different KPI. Let's put it in corporate terms.
Actually, you're right. I mean, I like that. That's a very nice way of putting it. So replacing, the current idea of replacing fossil with renewables with the idea that the shares are much less important than the net outcome, which is the carbon emission of the system as a whole. Yes, in that sense, it's a more holistic approach.
And then another question. So if you are right, if we fail with reaching Paris targets, then indeed mitigation is not sufficient. We need much more adaptation efforts. And when I was together with my colleagues at NEAH looking at adaptation technologies, actually, we see that, first of all, there are not so many of them on the table. Second, they are mainly very capital intensive and they require governmental funding. So they not that attractive for the private investors. It's more about state money. So to build all these dams and to implement all these early warning smart systems for hurricanes or droughts or floodings or whatever. So how do you think this should evolve? Because so far we as humankind, we still prefer to focus on our hope, not on the approaching threats.
That's right. And there is room, I think, for considerable degrees of skepticism. Just look at the Californian wildfires and the way people build their houses, regardless, Always everybody hopes, hope dies last. Everybody hopes it will not hit him. There are mechanisms which one can use. Again, government intervention doesn't need always to be that government spends the money. They can just enforce regulations and force others to spend the money. So if you want to build your house in a certain area threatened by flooded, you have to build a certain wall, otherwise you can't build a house. So regulation doesn't cost the government anything. There are other mechanisms which would run through the insurance policy. So you get insurance only if you have certain security enhancing effects. So all of that needs to be explored. It's very much nitty-gritty, but I think primarily for the reason you have said, that everybody always hopes he is not affected, he or she, is why adaptation has sort of slipped way down on the agenda. It's not talked about it very often anymore. It's not a particularly exciting topic, but I would expect it to come back if we have this combination of continued severe weather disturbances and things like the Paris targets not to be reached. There's also something in the middle a little bit between mitigation and adaptation and between avoiding issuing more greenhouse gas emissions and taking them out, which is efficiency improvements. Very important and terribly important also in that framework because it addresses directly the question of energy intensity. So the more we manage to improve the efficiency by carbon prices or other means of the system as a whole, the lower energy intensity will be, and the more wiggle room exists for actually fast-growing industrializing economies to actually replace fossil fuels with non-fossil fuels, which should remain an important part of the agenda. No? You don't want to kill that, and that I think is bound to play a bigger role, because that's the ideal field for governments to regulate themselves out of business. But I mean, to really be a pain, as we have seen again in the post-Ukrainian situation, the German discussion on the heating systems, what kind of gas heaters should be allowed and should not be allowed. And it's a terrible area because hyperactive governments will do a lot of things, including a lot of mistakes. And it's a good area because it affects everybody and forces people to think. And hopefully at the end of these processes, there are some real efficiency improvements. And that would be a step forward. Because, that this also allows others to leapfrog.
Yeah, I completely agree with you and strongly support this focus on energy efficiency. And, we at the New Energy Advancement Hub, we've developed a special online course on energy management for individuals, for SMEs, which allows, we've tested it, 30% reduction in energy bills. It's like guaranteed. But it's not as sexy, as attractive as, let's say, green hydrogen or batteries or something like this. So people prefer, though it's lowest hanging fruit and it allows to avoid energy consumption at all. So the best green energy is the energy which is not produced, in my understanding. But nevertheless, it's something in the mindset, like spending 2 hours in total in order to calculate all your appliances and go around your house and fix all leakages. It's not, you do not feel that you are doing something technologically advanced, that it is really making a good contribution to the energy transition. How can we change this perception? Because, as I said, we are talking about 20 to 30% of energy demand in total. Yeah. How can it be changed?
The economist's answer is make energy more expensive.
Yes.
It still only means it's too low. But it's very, very interesting because I was looking at, when you look into investment funds which deal with the energy transition, there are some, of course, who focus on wind and solar and alternative fuels and all that, and they have probably done very well. Well, they have done very well on the costs coming down, and now sort of bottling out is very little to gain. I was looking at funds also which explicitly invested in efficiency enhancing measures, and they have not outperformed benchmark measures like the normal stock market at all, indicating exactly what you said. It's not somehow is not a business yet which is rewarded financially. Also from the investment side, not from the consumer side, you mentioned it, but also from the investment side, not. Why is that? And I think by and large, it's not sexy, that's true, but behind that is probably that the sums which are involved are still too low. I don't really have another explanation. Or the steps which are necessary to be taken are still too unclear and too complicated. So people think of, oh no, I don't want to replace my heating. It's like, why do people not change bank accounts all the time when it can be shown that they have much better conditions at some other bank than the bank that it's one of the most sticky things in economic life. They don't change bank accounts. Who knows what? And I think it's because everybody knows it's such a pain to do it, and you have to change it on every letter, on every transaction, everywhere. And people maybe in a similar way look at efficiency improvements as I have to double glazing, I have to change my heating. My life is complicated enough. And you can change that only by increasing the financial reward. That means making energy or emissions, in this case, more expensive, or by forcing them to do it. And that means you get into this messy discussions which you just had, at least in Germany within Europe, about how to enforce it, and you create a lot of resentment this way, which is also difficult. But I agree, it's a sticky question and not clear why. It's clear why, but it's hard to answer how to get out of it.
Christof, we are approaching to the end of our conversation, but before I want to end it at a good, enthusiastic and optimistic note. So, in the year 2024, what are your expectations? Which positive changes we could see? Where should our hopes and our efforts be focused in order to obtain energy transition, energy security, economic growth, Yeah, so all these good things we are all wishing for.
All the good things. Well, we had this running theme of hope now in this discussion. So there's little hope, no? But the hope is that people realize that the current way of approaching this transition has been a little bit too narrow. The hope is that responsible people, politicians and others, realize and admit that certain targets will not be reachable. The hope is that this doesn't create a big backlash in the population, but more of saying, okay, so we have to be smarter and we have to continue and double down our efforts in a smart way. And the hope is that that finally gets us into some tangible process where at least the emission side comes under pressure and emissions go down, regardless of how maybe the underlying system is slower to adjust, because the guide should be the transmissions and the emissions and nothing else. And since we have said many times hope dies last, I think that 2024 is a year where actually these things could happen, all of them. The discussions, the announcements, and the clarity that one doesn't want to give up on this project.
Sounds like a toast, Christof. Thank you so much. That was really extremely interesting and eye-opening. And I would say I completely agree with this wish for 2024, like a year of disillusionment, because we are all grown-ups and we are responsible people, and we can face this unpleasant truth. When we see this unpleasant truth, we can do something to fix it and to change it and to develop really smart new solutions, which will lead us to better worlds and for our children. Anyway, thank you so much. That was a great discussion. And thank you for joining us, dear friends, and goodbye on that.
Thank you very much for having me, and keep it up, have these discussions. That's the best chance all of us have. Just keep thinking and talking and enjoy. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.